It's amazing what happens when you go to art galleries. Sometimes it's a solitary experience where you just sit and enjoy the paintings. But other times, the paintings cause debate. They spark conversation. And it's sometimes at these moments where we want to share our views of art with each other. Recently, I had been back home to my home city of Liverpool, where I was at my favourite art gallery, the Walker. The Walker Art Gallery houses many paintings, and in one of the gallery's rooms is a painting by Benjamin West called The Death of Nelson. It was while I was looking at this painting that I met a man called Graham. Graham has been coming to the gallery whenever he gets the chance, in lunch breaks and in afternoon excursions. We started talking about art and painting, and we went outside to discuss the painting in more detail. Okay, Graham, hello. It's nice to meet you. So you were telling me you're a big supporter of the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool.
Yes, I like it. I visit it on a regular basis. I like the Death of Nelson by some American called West.
Benjamin West, yes. And it's quite a large painting, would you say? Yes, it hangs on in one of the big walls in the gallery.
Big picture.
Yeah. And at the very centre of this painting we have Nelson in the middle. It's interesting that you chose this painting. Why this painting in particular?
Because though it's his death, it's very stylised death, and everybody's in the right position. All the officers around him are all where they should be seen to be correct. But also in the same picture, you've got what looks like Marines who are throwing their hats off and like celebrating the victories. If they're there and part of the death of Nelson, but I haven't got a clue what's going on. Oh yes, it was the great event of the period, wasn't it?
Yes. And do you think it's a highly sanitised depiction of death, or is it real? How did it make you feel?
There's a cleanness of it. Yeah, his what would it be? His man is kneeling next to him, sort of like in a heroic pose, and he's even dying beautifully in a straight line. There's none of what is real death, which is sort of like, especially when you've been shot as he had, of broken flesh and blood and things like that. This is more like, I wouldn't say a beautified version, but it's sterile, cleaned up and everything.
It seems to me that there's also a moral that comes with this painting, that if one fights and does good for their country, their death will be glorious. And do you think that comes through in his depiction of his death?
Oh yes, they're trying to paint, this was part of a glorious victory. And the nation should be proud, and everybody was in their correct position, all the officers and the ruling classes. And the fact that maybe some people in the picture maybe didn't know what was going on, well, they're the minor ones and they don't really care.
And this is obviously a lot different to the work I've been doing on Death and the Maiden, which is a motif that explores female death. So here we're presented with something which is, much more masculine. It's glorified. The male figure is beautified. He looks refined despite being dead. Had it not been for the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, that you would have had an interest in this painting or this type of heroic painting?
Yeah, it really was, because it was there, it drew attention, and since then I've found out, since I started to look at it, that it's not the only version of the Death of Nelson. There are a few of them in various other galleries. Can there be such a thing as the best picture of someone's death when there's multiple, and none of the paintings were actually there at the time? It was all done. They're all done from hearsay and from impressions of how it should have been, which most probably was nothing like reality at all.
Do you think 21st century society still considers death a taboo subject? Obviously, that was painted in a period where we were more able to talk about death. Death happened in the home, death happened on a regular basis. Diseases often took children very young. Death was more a prevalent concern. Do you think now we're intrigued by this painting because death is something that happens in hospitals and behind closed doors and we don't talk about it.
Yes, we definitely don't. That's where society's moved. And yes, it's one of the rare these days chances to, to have a picture of a death. But even then, it's not, whenever it was painted at early 18-somethings, it wasn't reality at all.
I met Susan at the National Gallery of Ireland. We were both escaping a very cloudy and rainy day in Dublin. We were both sat looking at a Caravaggio painting entitled The Taking of Christ. Next to it was a work by Gentileschi, and that was of David and Goliath. Both were about death, but in two separate ways. One explored a physical death, as shown through David and Goliath, and one was more about the reflective and emotional side of death. I spoke to Susan when we had a spare moment outside of that particular room in the gallery, and she spoke to me about why the Caravaggio work was her favourite. Out of the two paintings that we saw in the room earlier, which was your favourite painting?
The Caravaggio.
Okay, so you like the painting by Caravaggio. Could you tell us why?
Because it's not actually a depiction of death. It's the suggestion of an oncoming death. Christ knows he's going to be crucified. This is the moment of his betrayal and the realisation of the sacrifice he must make. The other painting's too grotesque for my liking.
As you say, one is physical, the other is emotional. So therefore, do you think Caravaggio's painting of, the emotions, do you think that's a sanitised portrayal of death? Because, there's no actual death there.
No, it's a portrayal of the emotions.
So you clearly find that more important. And do you think 21st century audiences find death a taboo subject? It's not something we usually explore, I don't think.
I don't know, but I personally don't enjoy grotesque paintings with blood and gore.
Speaking to Susan and Graham, I got a better idea about how we feel about death in art. We're okay to celebrate death of great figures who have achieved heroic glory, and we seem to seek solace in seeing grief so that we can identify with it ourselves. But it seems altogether we are slightly scared of it. One motif that aimed to end the fear of death was that of Death and the Maiden. The medieval period and the Renaissance were quite literally plagued by death. The universal nature of death was particularly important in a depiction known as the Danse Macabre. Paintings containing the scene of this dance of death were prevalent in the Gothic-era France. In most depictions, death danced with everyone around it, popes, emperors, kings, and beggars. The depictions followed the aims of the Church in proving that death was a universal quantifier and that humans shouldn't focus upon the supposed materialistic glories of earthly life. In these paintings, death was portrayed as a grim reaper figure, or the horse from Revelation. Women were also found in paintings of the Dance of Death or the Danse Macabre. In the depictions of these dances of death, Death and the Maiden was a motif and became a highly prevalent piece of symbolism. Erotic and sexual in its depiction, it developed to become a common motif found throughout paintings from the Renaissance to the present day. One could say it evolved to be a trope in its own right. During this huge period, we see a transition from death depicted as a dark and hooded figure. Death and the Maiden no longer became a warning about moral pride or petty concerns of beauty. By the 1900s, in an age of anxiety where Nietzsche had proclaimed that God did not exist, Death and the Maiden was one of the many outlets to explore one's relationship with mortality and the afterlife. Throughout the centuries, the concept of a young woman being seduced by a death-like figure fueled many imaginations. The original didactic message of these images was that death would come to people as quickly as the youthful maiden's looks would fade. These depictions began to show the connections between the themes of sexuality and death, two seemingly interchangeable themes. However, this wasn't so strong in earlier depictions of the motif. In early portrayals, it appeared as though the maiden was dancing with a figure that represented death, and the sense of sexuality could have been considered to be weak. This is seen in Hans Baldung Grien's painting. Hans Baldung Grien was a student of the famous Albrecht Dürer, and his depiction of this theme correlated to the symbolism of a young woman being seduced by a death-like figure. There doesn't seem to be much sexuality, just violence. Death is seen holding the maiden's hair in his hand. Forcefully he pushes her into the ground or tomb that lies before her. Death is a skeleton who manages to hold a sly grin on his face. Due to the taboo that followed paintings of nudes, the theme may have allowed the painter to show a naked woman. Teary and in prayer, her face displays a sense of shock as death forces her downwards. This reaction could be indicative of her surprise at death, showing that worship of earthly glories distracted one from their own rites of passage. As the years progressed, death became involved in an erotic discourse with the maiden. Painted in the same year as Hans Baldung Grien's work, Niklaus Manuel Deutsch's work of the same name was painted in 1515 and explores the theme in a much more sexual nature. Death is a grotesque figure and grasps the young maiden sexually, clasping at her breasts, grabbing at her neck and pubic area. Despite death's grotesque appearance, the maiden does not appear to shun death. This work has been considered the first indication of the transition from the dance of death to the death of the maiden, and this is also one of the first instances of death and the maiden sharing an erotic relationship with each other. The motif of death and the maiden had its origins in the Greek myth of Hades and Persephone. Hades, who was the Greek god of the underworld, fell in love with Persephone. Hades wanted Persephone to be his bride, and while Hades' brother Zeus approved of the marriage, Persephone's mother Demeter did not. One day when Persephone was out gathering flowers, Hades came to Persephone and took her immediately to the underworld. Her capture has often been described as a figurative and literal deflowering, and very often this myth is known as the rape of Persephone. Upon realizing Persephone's disappearance, her mother scoured the earth looking for her, leaving desolation in her wake. Eventually a deal was made with Hades, Persephone, her mother, and Zeus, and it was decided that she should be allowed to spend 6 months on earth and 6 months in the underworld, therefore creating the seasons of summer and winter. Come the age of the Baroque, and the movement towards classical themes in art, the pagan nature of Death and the Maiden fell out of favour with artistic audiences. Death and the Maiden began to directly relate to its founding myth, the rape of Persephone. Bernini's sculpture is famed world over, but is not necessarily linked to the theme of Death and the Maiden. However, I believe it could be interpreted in that way. Skilled sculptor Bernini completed the work in 1621, and it is considered to be a masterpiece in marble, capturing the drama and struggle of Persephone's abduction. This is enhanced through a twisted stance and a fleshy texture of the marble against Hades' hands. The theme of Death and the Maiden also serves as a memento mori. In the mid-19th century onwards, death wasn't always a hooded masculine figure. Anton Josef Yertz makes use of two figures in his painting Two Young Girls. Painted in 1847, it is an interesting approach to the motif of Death and the Maiden. The painting focuses upon the image of a young, whimsical woman. She is depicted fully, with rosy cheeks and a rounded stomach, which could be considered to be suggestive of fertility. Her nakedness could also be described as being sensual. Opposite stands a skeleton. Her reaction to the skeleton could be described as being amused, or confused and possibly intrigued by its presence. The skeleton in front of her, though, stands as a memento mori. It's highly detailed anatomically correct, and it shows the talent of the artist. But attached to the skull is a label, and on that label is a description of the skeleton as the young girl. So therefore in this painting we have a picture of a beautiful, young, healthy, fertile woman at the peak of life, staring at her own death. It's pretty interesting. From it we can understand that the sentiments that were prevalent in 15th century and 16th century art regarding death and the maiden are also apparent in the 19th century. However, some people believe this to be more than just a reworking of the theme of the brevity of life, or that death is coming for you regardless of your beauty. It's not just beauty that is explored here, but eroticism. The woman's stance towards the skeleton is defiant. Almost, she seems confident in her naked body, and yet the retaliation from the skeleton is that death is waiting for her. It seems to condemn the erotic as a bad and malignant presence, a damaging concern. Edvard Munch was a painter of a society in change. The European identity had been shaken in the years beforehand through revolution, and now a new identity had to be taken. The city and the metropolis was growing in size. Modernity had a full grip on the public of Europe. Cities were huge places full of bustling, busy crowds, of people with places to go. They comprised of long, imposing, straight streets designed to suppress revolution that had once lurked in the winding corners of earlier cities. Their size and fast pace of life made the city an alienating place, especially for those who had moved from quiet provincial towns. New philosophical ideas were emerging, and people's relationship with religion was changing too. Freud was completing instrumental work in Vienna on psychoanalysis, and a sense of anxiety pervaded over Europe, a fact supported by the opening of asylums in Austria. Edvard Munch's work demonstrated not only his inner turmoil, but reflected that society in change, a society struggling to come to terms with its upheaval. In Munch's paintings, he depicted crowds of men and women, confused, alienated, frightened, and fearful. Munch's work also shows once more a total shift in the motif of death and the maiden. The particular work I will talk about is an engraving completed in 1894, based on an earlier depiction in the work The Frieze of Life. In this work, Death and the Maiden finds herself in a loving embrace with death. Death is not feared. It is not even welcomed. It is sort of there, a presence that can't be avoided. Death greets the maiden with a kiss, while the maiden appears extremely welcoming of its presence. The skeleton is not painted with the same anatomical correctness of Anton Josef Yertz's painting. It's made up of lines, and is more a suggestion of bones rather than a detailed depiction. The skeleton is overcome by the woman, not vice versa. The powerful and controlling nature of the woman suggests a surrender in the skeleton, who stretches the legs of its body out towards the woman. While Anton Josef Yertz's work appeared to be disparaging of sexuality, Munch's work demonstrates the very opposite. I feel that there is a sense of completion in this painting, that this meeting between the individuals has been long in coming. Looking at this painting, we feel as though we are voyeurs, witnessing a somewhat disturbing yet sexual encounter. This painting shows a remarkable transition in the painting style of Western artists, but also an interesting shift in the way in which death and the maiden encounter each other in works that follow this motif. Marianne Stokes painted Death and the Maiden a few years later, in 1900. This painting takes a rather different approach to the trope of Death and the Maiden. There appears to be a dialogue between Death and the young girl in the painting. In this painting, the figure of Death isn't a controlling male figure, or an oppressive force. She is a female figure, clothed in black, but there seems to be something rather comforting in her presence as she sits on the end of the young girl's bed. This is in contrast to the depictions of the 1500s, where a male presence put power over a weak-willed female, and also in contrast to Monk, who makes use of a romantic and possibly sexual partnership. By using this composition, Stokes shows the young girl in the painting as accepting of her fate to die. Therefore, there is an acceptance, almost a compromise, between Death and the Maiden. In the years that followed the shift in the style of Death and the Maiden as an artistic motif, there was a total reimagining and repurposing of the subject. This took place in conjunction with changing techniques in art. From the 1900s onwards, art began to drift away from figurative depiction to abstract depiction. The motif reoccurred numerous times, but one of the most poignant examples could be considered to be a work by Joseph Beuys in the late 1950s. Joseph Beuys was one of the first artists to confront the issue of the Holocaust. Artwork that focuses upon the Holocaust is considered to be extremely important in understanding the horrendous events that took place. It is just as important as written, spoken or filmed testimonies, letters, plays, poetry, and other artifacts and artistic endeavours produced by survivors or those who were alive during the events that took place. The figures are two smears on the back of an envelope stamped with Auschwitz. Unlike Munch's and more like Marianne Stokes's work, there is a meeting between them on positive grounds. There is an acceptance between the two of them, and her embrace of death. There is a sense of finality between the two of them, almost as if the figures have been waiting for this occurrence. It is not clear whether the human figure is dead or alive, but it is emaciated, exactly as though it were a Holocaust survivor. The woman is intrinsically linked to cycles, the menstrual cycle, the birth cycle, the life cycle. And because of this emphasis on birth, it is no wonder, therefore, that she is intrinsically linked to death. It's so interesting that such a simple motif of a partnership between two opposites should be so widely repeated, developed, changed, and subverted for moral, artistic, and psychoanalytical purposes. Death and the Maiden is a truly fascinating exploration of gendered death. After meeting Graham and Susan at two separate galleries and understanding their stance on death, and through my own work on Death and the Maiden, I've come to understand that we're still quite unsettled when it comes to death. Recently, I attended the Liverpool Passion Plays, written by Liverpool organist Daniel Bishop. The plays comprised of a large cast and drew hundreds every night to see them, that took place on the 9-metre-high Dulverton Bridge at Liverpool Cathedral. While I was in the audience, I met Fiona. Like mine, it was Fiona's first time at the Liverpool Passion Plays, and afterwards I spoke to her about witnessing the death of Christ in drama. For Christian audiences, the sight of Christ on the cross is not something to feel scared of or upset about. In fact, his death in Christian iconography is something we see all the time. But imagine if we were presented with us there in front of our eyes, in a dramatic interpretation. Fiona had a lot of thoughts on this subject.
It was most emotional when Christ was screaming on the cross and the pink appeared on the curtains, the Lent colours, and the 1,000 angels by your side started singing.
Yeah.
That was the most emotional. And then I think when everyone was laying down the daffodils and it was all sinking in with everyone, that was when it reached its emotional climax.
As a person, do you think it's more difficult to talk about death? Do you feel there's a taboo around death?
Yes, apart from biblical death.
You think there's no taboo in biblical death?
No, because I feel everyone has come to terms with it, and there's a God built around it.
Yeah.
And there are religions built around it, and I think that it has a kind of veil over it, whereas everyday people you care about, or people normal everyday death is
More
taboo,
upsetting.
because it's real, whereas I think people find biblical death not real, even though it is to the people who believe in it.
So that's why, we were stood there with a 21st century audience feeling fairly comfortable at the sight of Christ's crucifixion, because it's something so familiar to us.
Yeah, and then you had a little girl behind me who honestly thought he was dying and was crying.
This is interesting. So the shock comes from the unexpected.
Yes.
We expect his death, so we're not...
We all know it happens.
We all know it happens.
We still get sad. I still felt very sad. I'm very humbled, but I know that it'll be okay in 3 days' time. But, yeah. That's what I think.
While I had spoken a lot about art, and my own feelings about art, and other people's feelings, I hadn't actually spoken to any actual artists. I met up with a friend of mine, Alex Childs, who does a lot of art with ArtSock. She draws regularly, she contributes regularly to various artistic ventures, and I thought she'd be really interesting to talk to. We sat down and we spoke about death and some of the paintings that I had explored on the earlier part of this podcast.
I am joined by a member of this community. I'm joined by Alex Childs. And you do a lot of work with the Art Society, don't you, in St Andrews? So, as you know, I've been doing a podcast about death, and in particular I've been looking at death in the Maiden. But first of all, I'm going to ask you, is death something that you explore in your work?
I'm going to have to think about that, go back a couple of paintings. If it's there, then it's quite subtle. It's not something explicit. There was a drawing of someone drowning, holding a guitar above the water, and another one inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And I don't know, if you look at that image, then you probably would think of death.
Do you think, as a 21st century audience, we are scared to talk about death, and do you think we're scared to look at paintings of death?
No. No, I think we're desensitized to death in general.
So I have been exploring a number of paintings based on the theme of death in the Maiden. This painting that I've got with me now, it's not actually entitled Death in the Maiden, it's entitled Two Young Girls. So, just a quick recap of our podcast. Death in the Maiden is an artistic motif of a skeleton or something symbolising death, like the Grim Reaper, dancing with a young, healthy woman. Sometimes death is dominating, he controls her. For example, in an early 15th century painting, he's pushing her into a hole. But come the 1900s, death is locked in a romantic embrace with the Maiden. Do you have any feelings about this painting? Is anything jumping out at you? As an artist, do you think?
Probably her gaze, the way she's looking at the skeleton into the sockets, the eye sockets. It's not... I'll have a closer look. I don't think it's one precisely of fear, the expression on her face. It's more interest, which is kind of jarring.
I think it's challenging.
I think it's definitely challenging.
When I looked at this before, it didn't jump out, but I think she's looking at the skeleton like, go on.
There's no cower. There's no
she's
cower,
very
especially in the angle of her body as well, and the way it's shaded. It's
almost a sort of come at me.
Yeah.
Go on, I'm ready for this. Come at me.
I think so too.
I think it bridges the dominance that death had over women in the earlier paintings to the sexual relationship that was had. If I bring up some this is what I've been talking about. That's extremely sexual.
Extremely.
It's almost like a reunion. Like they've both been waiting for this to happen. Do you agree? I think there's a sort of cathartic release in it.
It seems to be. I think the position of the skeleton seems almost way the leg's coming through. I mean, whilst the pose actually looks quite awkward and she looks like she's in control.
Yeah,
But then
I like that.
You see the arms of the skeleton around her body and the leg coming through her legs. I think it's pretty obvious what that could represent.
She seems to be in control, and also
Yeah.
the skeleton doesn't seem real, but there's a figurative depiction to her body.
Yeah.
Art is derivative of literature, and there are quite a lot of artworks which depend upon literary events. I met up with my friend Megan. Megan studies Russian and is extremely passionate about Russian literature. One of the stories that she's really passionate about is The Queen of Spades, one which features death heavily, and particularly the death of a woman. I invited Megan to talk about one of the paintings I had found in relation to this story, and why the particular character had been portrayed in quite a masculine way in her death.
I'm joined by Megan. Megan grew up in Scotland, but found herself living in New York, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and in Prague in the Czech Republic. She joined us now, back again in Scotland. Megan studies Russian, and herself is a keen writer, writing poetry, and I think she makes an interesting person to talk to about this subject. And one of Megan's favourite stories is The Queen of Spades by Pushkin, and it's a Russian story.
Think of Pushkin as the Russian version of Lord Byron. Dangerous snow, lots of hedonism. So the Queen of Spades is basically this character, German. He's in St. Petersburg, and he hears this anecdote from one of his friends, and his friend talks about a story including his grandma, and this is the Countess. And when she was in Paris, and she was referred to as the Muscovite Venus, she got herself into some great gambling debts and found a card trick taught to her by, I believe, a man called Saint-Germain. So German beforehand isn't into gambling, he just watches. He's like a hawk in the background, but then he hears this anecdote and suddenly his ears prick up and he becomes interested. And then he figures out where the Countess lives, and he sees her ward, Elizaveta Ivanovna, and sees her as a ploy to get into the house. And basically once he's manipulated her, he gets in and he pesters the Countess for the card trick, and she goes, no, it was a joke, really. But then he draws a gun to threaten her, but she dies of fright. And then he starts seeing her ghost, and he becomes more and more sorry, and he goes to her funeral and everything. It's always struck me as such a strange depiction of death, and I find it incredibly interesting. And this is going to sound really morbid, but I'm very interested in the psychological aspects surrounding death, and particularly somebody's reaction to a death that they specifically have caused. And so from that perspective, I find this story particularly interesting.
So, when you told me you were going to talk about this story, I did a little bit of research, looked through a few books, and I discovered this painting by Alexandre Benoit, and it's from 1919, and going towards the abstract, but funnily enough, this is a figurative depiction. This isn't abstract art. This is, fairly recognisable. It's called Death of the Countess, and we've got the painting in front of us here. Can you tell me what's going on? Which part of the story is this from?
This is as German has basically broken into the house, and Elizaveta has found out that he has deceived her and everything, and he seems to have just threatened the Countess, and she has died of fright.
I find it really interesting. Maybe this is just the way the artist has portrayed her, but I kind of find her a little bit masculine. Is that just me?
She is described in the story Pushkin goes a little bit overboard on descriptions, but she's described as being very crow-like, very like old and batty. Both in her youth and in her old age, she's a very domineering, authoritative woman. So her personality is already masculine. So it makes sense for me personally to portray her as such in the painting. And
Death in art is a huge subject. It covers many ground, and we frankly don't have enough time to talk about as much as I'd like to. But I hope I've introduced you as well as I can to some interesting themes, some interesting stories, and shared with you the opinions of some people in our student community. Thank you.